It was a bright Saturday morning when Thomas stepped out onto his front porch. The air was crisp, and the birds were singing their usual morning songs. He stretched his arms above his head, enjoying the peace and quiet of the small suburban neighborhood. The world seemed calm, but he had no idea that today would be different. As he made his way to the end of the driveway to pick up the newspaper, a loud noise made him freeze. A letter had been shoved through his mailbox, and it was practically vibrating against the door. He turned around, his brow furrowing. Who could be sending something so urgent at this hour? Thomas walked back to the door and grabbed the letter. His eyes were immediately drawn to the bold, red stamp on the top, urgent. The letters seemed to jump off the paper, and a feeling of dread began to settle in his chest. He didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, had been a thorn in his side for as long as he could remember. For years, they had complained about his garden. To them, it was too wild, too colorful, too full of life. Thomas never understood why they couldn't appreciate the beauty he saw in it. The flowers, the old stone fountain, and the mix of bushes he had poured his heart into making his front yard a peaceful, vibrant place. But the HOA had their rules, and according to them, those rules didn't have room for anything outside of the norm. Thomas had received warnings before, each one more aggressive than the last. But this letter felt different. It didn't just threaten a small fine or a warning to make minor changes. No, this time it was serious. The letter in his hand claimed that his garden was a violation of community guidelines. They called it unsightly and detrimental to the neighborhood's aesthetic. And the worst part? They were fining him $5,000 for it. He stood there, staring at the paper in disbelief. $5,000. For his garden. A garden he had worked on for years. A garden that, to him, was beautiful and full of life. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore. He couldn't believe it. The more he read, the angrier he became. The letter even included a list of suggestions for how he could improve his garden. Remove the overgrown plants, fix the unsightly fountain, and trim the wild bushes. They wanted him to turn it into something bland and boring just like every other yard in the neighborhood. Thomas shook his head, his hands trembling slightly as he folded the letter back in half. He couldn't accept this. It wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for what he believed in. His garden had always been his sanctuary, and he wasn't about to let a group of faceless people tell him what he could and couldn't do with his own property. He glanced out at the garden in question. The vibrant colors of the flowers, the soft trickle of water from the fountain, the gentle sway of the bushes, it all felt like a small piece of paradise. And now, the HOA wanted to take that away from him. He couldn't let them. His mind raced with possibilities. What could he do? He had already tried talking to them before, explaining that he loved his garden and that it brought joy to him and the people who passed by. But all they saw was a violation. They didn't care about the effort he put into it. They didn't care about the way it made him feel. They only cared about following the rules. Thomas sighed and went back inside, the letter still clutched in his hand. He tossed it onto the kitchen table and stared out the window at the garden. He felt a deep sense of unfairness. Why was it so wrong to want something different, something beautiful? Wasn't a little color, a little life, what made the world interesting? The phone on the counter buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text message from his neighbor, Lisa. "Hey, did you get the letter from the HOA?" Thomas felt his frustration build again. It seemed that everyone had received the same notice. It wasn't just his garden they had a problem with, it was the entire neighborhood. And now, he was the one being punished for it. He typed back a quick reply. "Yes, and they're fining me $5,000 for it." "Can you believe that?" Lisa responded almost immediately. "That's ridiculous. I'll be over in a bit. Let's talk about it." Thomas put his phone down, his mind racing. He didn't want to back down. This wasn't just about a garden. It was about standing up for what he believed was right. But what could he do? He wasn't sure what his options were, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let them take his garden without a fight. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat on his front porch, staring out at the garden with a frown on his face. The letter from the HOA was still lying on the kitchen table, and he couldn't seem to shake the anger bubbling inside him. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Lisa, his next-door neighbor, stepped out of her car, shaking her head as she walked toward him. She had a look of disbelief on her face, one that mirrored Thomas's own. "Did you really get the letter?" she asked, her voice low, as if she couldn't believe what she was saying. Thomas nodded, his eyes still on the garden. "Yeah, $5,000 fine for my garden. They say it's unsightly." He almost spat the word, his voice thick with frustration. Lisa sat down beside him, glancing over at the garden that had earned him such a hefty fine. "It's ridiculous," she said. "Your garden is beautiful. Everyone in the neighborhood loves it. I've even had people stop by and take pictures of it. Who cares if it's a little different?" "I care," Thomas replied, his tone sharp. "This isn't just about the garden anymore. It's about standing up to these people who think they can control everything. They have no right to tell me what I can and can't do with my own yard." Lisa nodded in agreement. "I get it. But a $5,000 fine is a lot to fight. What are you going to do?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, sighing deeply. "I don't know. I've thought about going to a lawyer, but I don't even know where to start. They've been threatening to fine me for years, but this is just too much. They can't just come in and destroy everything I've worked so hard for." Lisa leaned back in her chair, thinking for a moment. "Well, have you ever thought about talking to the city? I know the HOA has its rules, but maybe they don't know how important your garden is to the neighborhood." Thomas turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Lisa explained. "You know how they have that historic landmark program for things that are important to the area? Maybe you could get your garden registered as a landmark. If it's officially recognized by the city, the HOA wouldn't have the power to fine you for it anymore. They'd have to leave you alone." Thomas's eyes widened. "That's a great idea. But how do I even start?" Lisa smiled. "I'll help you. Let's go down to City Hall and talk to someone about it. We can find out what it takes to get it designated as a historic landmark." Without wasting any time, they both got up, and Lisa drove Thomas to the local City Hall. The building was old, with brick walls and tall windows. As they stepped inside, the cool air hit them, and they made their way to the front desk. A kind-looking woman greeted them, and after a quick explanation of their situation, she directed them to a small office down the hall. Inside, an older man sat behind a desk, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up as they entered, offering a warm smile. "How can I help you today?" Thomas took a deep breath. "We're here about my garden," he began. "I've been fined by the HOA for what they call an eyesore, but I believe it's an important part of the neighborhood. Is there any way I can get it recognized as a historic landmark?" The man raised an eyebrow. "A garden? That's an unusual request. But not impossible. We've had a few cases where people wanted their gardens or other personal properties recognized for their historical value." Lisa jumped in. "We think the garden adds character to the neighborhood, and it's something that brings people together. People take pictures of it all the time. It's unique. We just want to make sure it's protected from the HOA." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, if you want to get it designated as a historic landmark, you'll need to prove its historical or cultural significance. We'd have to evaluate the garden and see if it meets certain criteria. I'd recommend gathering any information you have about the garden's history and significance to the area." Thomas and Lisa exchanged a look. It sounded like a lot of work, but it was worth a shot. "We can do that," Thomas said. "We'll gather everything we can." "How long do you think it'll take?" The man leaned back in his chair. "It usually takes a few weeks to process the application. After that, the city council will vote on whether or not it meets the criteria. If they approve it, your garden would be officially recognized, and the HOA won't be able to touch it." Lisa smiled. "That sounds perfect. Thank you so much." With a plan in place, they left City Hall feeling more hopeful than they had all day. Thomas couldn't believe it. If the city recognized his garden as a historic landmark, the HOA wouldn't be able to fine him anymore. In fact, they'd have to treat it as a protected piece of the neighborhood. As they walked back to Lisa's car, Thomas felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting the HOA anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, the right to be himself and to keep the garden that had brought him so much joy. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Thomas. He spent every free moment gathering information about his garden, taking pictures, and writing down notes. Lisa helped as much as she could, visiting the local library to look up old records and even speaking to neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. They wanted to build a solid case to show the city that Thomas's garden wasn't just another patch of flowers, it was an important part of the community's history. One evening, as Thomas sat at his kitchen table, sorting through the papers, he felt a sense of determination he hadn't felt in a long time. The letter from the HOA still lay on the table, but now it didn't seem as threatening. He had a goal, a purpose. And if he succeeded in getting his garden recognized as a historic landmark, the HOA would no longer have any say in the matter. But as the days passed and the application deadline grew closer, doubts began to creep in. What if they couldn't prove the garden's historical significance? What if the city rejected their application? The thought made Thomas uneasy, but he pushed it aside. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. On the morning they planned to submit the application, Lisa drove them both to City Hall once more. They carried a large folder filled with photos, maps, and letters of support from neighbors. The folder felt heavy in Thomas's hands, and as they stepped into the familiar City Hall lobby, he couldn't help but feel nervous. The bright lights and polished floors seemed almost too formal for something as personal as a garden. But he knew this was the right thing to do. They walked up to the front desk, and the same woman from before greeted them with a smile. "Back again, I see. Are you ready to submit your application?" Lisa smiled back. "We are. We've gathered everything we could. We really hope it makes a difference." The woman nodded and motioned for them to follow her. "Let me take you to Mr. Johnson. He'll make sure everything is in order before you turn it in." Thomas followed her down the hallway, his heart racing. Lisa gave him an encouraging smile, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too much. What if they didn't approve it? What if the city didn't see the value in his garden? They reached the small office at the end of the hall, and the door opened to reveal Mr. Johnson, the same older man they had spoken to earlier. He stood up as they entered, greeting them warmly. "Ah, you've brought everything. Let's see what you have." Lisa and Thomas set the folder on the desk, and Mr. Johnson flipped through the papers with interest. He paused on one of the old photographs of the garden, taken when Thomas had first moved in. The black and white image showed the original version of the garden, much smaller and less refined but still vibrant with wildflowers. Thomas explained how the garden had evolved over the years, growing with his family and becoming a personal project he poured his heart into. As Mr. Johnson continued to flip through the papers, Thomas couldn't help but notice how thoughtfully he examined each one. The photos, the maps, the letters, it was clear that the city cared about preserving things of value, even if those things were a little unusual. "I have to admit," Mr. Johnson said after a few moments, "this is an interesting case. A garden as a historic landmark is something we don't see every day. But I can see the effort you've put into this. You've made a compelling argument. Thomas felt a wave of relief. They weren't being dismissed outright. That was a good sign. Thank you, Thomas said, his voice quieter than usual. It's not just a garden to me. It's a place I put my heart and soul into. It's not just about flowers and plants, it's about the history of this neighborhood, the people who've lived here, and what we can pass on to future generations. Mr. Johnson nodded. I understand. You've done a good job of showing its significance. The next step is to get approval from the City Council, but I believe we'll be able to move forward with this. It may take a few weeks for the Council to review everything, but I'll make sure it's processed as quickly as possible. Lisa squeezed Thomas's shoulder. That's great news. Thank you so much for your help. The three of them exchanged a few more words, and then Mr. Johnson gave them a reassuring smile. You've done your part. Now we wait and see what the council decides. I'll be in touch once the review is complete. As they left City Hall, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but they had taken a huge step forward. The fight with the HOA wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about preserving what mattered to him, what mattered to the community. His garden wasn't just a piece of land, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for. But as they walked back to the car, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The HOA had always been determined to control what happened in the neighborhood. What if they fought back against the city's decision? What if they tried to take matters into their own hands? He pushed the thought aside for now. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had a chance, and that was all he needed. Whatever came next, he would be ready for it. Weeks passed in a blur of anticipation. Every day, Thomas checked his mailbox, hoping for an update from the city. Lisa stayed in touch, constantly asking if he'd heard anything, but the days dragged on with no word. It felt as though time was moving at a slower pace, each moment stretching on with the weight of uncertainty. Finally, on a crisp morning, the long-awaited letter arrived. It was from the City Council. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words were clear and official. We are pleased to inform you that the City Council has reviewed your application and has approved your garden for designation as a historic landmark. Your garden will be officially recognized as an important part of the neighborhood's history. Congratulations. He read the letter 3 times, making sure he hadn't misread it. It was real. His garden, the one the HOA had called an eyesore, had been recognized as a historic landmark. The victory felt even sweeter than he had imagined. But as quickly as the excitement settled in, a new thought crossed his mind. The HOA. What would they do now? Would they respect the decision, or would they continue their fight? The next day, Thomas received a phone call from Mr. Johnson at City Hall. He had good news to share officially. The garden was now a designated landmark. But he also had some advice. I recommend you be prepared for any backlash from the HOA, Mr. Johnson said. They may challenge the council's decision, especially if they feel it undermines their authority. It's not uncommon for homeowners associations to resist these types of designations. Thomas thanked him and hung up the phone. He wasn't surprised to hear about the possible resistance, but he was determined not to back down. He had worked too hard to see this garden thrive, and he wasn't about to let anyone tear it down literally or figuratively. That afternoon, he decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. He needed some time to think, to let the reality of the situation sink in. As he strolled down the quiet streets, he saw his neighbors out and about, some walking their dogs, others mowing their lawns. But when they saw him, they stopped what they were doing and waved. One by one, they came over to offer their congratulations. They'd heard the news, and they were excited for him. People who had admired his garden for years, people who had never spoken out against the HOA, were now offering their support. They were proud of him, and they wanted him to know that they stood behind him. Thomas, "You did it," said Mrs. Thompson from 2 doors down. "Your garden's always been a treasure. I'm glad the city finally recognized it." Others nodded in agreement. "It's a part of this neighborhood. We wouldn't be the same without it." Their support warmed Thomas's heart. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. No matter what the HOA tried to do, he knew he had the backing of the people who mattered. His garden wasn't just a piece of property, it was part of the fabric of the neighborhood, something that everyone appreciated. But the HOA was still a looming concern. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, staring out at the garden, he thought about what he needed to do next. It was only a matter of time before they responded. He couldn't let them intimidate him. But how could he make sure they wouldn't just try to tear everything down? The answer came to him slowly. The city had granted the garden historic status, but it was up to Thomas to protect it. He would need to keep pushing back, keep defending the garden, no matter how hard it got. The following week, a letter from the HOA arrived. It was addressed to Thomas, but the tone was nothing like the previous letters. This one was cold, formal, and almost threatening. The HOA demanded that he remove the garden and return it to its appropriate condition, threatening further fines if he didn't comply. Thomas folded the letter and set it down on the table. His first reaction was to feel angry, but then something changed. The letter no longer held the same power over him. The HOA could send him all the letters they wanted, but they couldn't take away the one thing that mattered most: the city had spoken. He made a decision. The next day, he would send a response to the HOA, letting them know that he had received the city's official designation. The garden was a historic landmark, and their threats no longer carried weight. He would not back down. As Thomas sat at the table drafting his response, he felt a sense of resolve settle over him. No matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't in this alone. His neighbors, the city, and most importantly, his own determination, would see him through. The next day, Thomas sat at his desk, staring at the letter from the HOA. He had drafted his response, but there was a lingering doubt in his mind. What if they took this further? What if they tried to go to court? His hand hovered over the paper as he thought about what to do next. He didn't have to think long. The city had already recognized his garden as a historic landmark, and that meant the HOA had no legal grounds to demand its removal. His mind was made up. He would send a letter. He carefully signed it, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it off. There was no turning back now. It was time to stand firm. The garden was important to him, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The days that followed were tense. Thomas went about his usual routine, but his mind was always on the garden and what the HOA might do next. Would they escalate the situation? Would they try to make his life difficult? On the morning of the following Friday, his phone rang. It was a call from Lisa, who had become a close ally in this fight. She had been by his side every step of the way, helping him gather information, offering advice, and most importantly, standing with him when he needed it most. "Hey, Thomas, I just got word from a few neighbors. They're saying the HOA is holding a special meeting this afternoon," Lisa said, her voice tense. "They might try to pull something. I don't know what, but I think it's a good idea for you to be there. They're not going to give up easily." Thomas's stomach tightened. The HOA was never one to back down from a fight. But this time, he was ready. He wasn't just fighting for his garden, he was fighting for his right to make decisions about his property, and for the support of his neighbors who had rallied behind him. "Thanks for the heads up, Lisa. I'll be there," he said, his voice calm but firm. That afternoon, Thomas arrived at the community center, where the HOA meeting was being held. As he walked through the doors, he could feel the tension in the air. The room was filled with members of the HOA, many of them standing in groups, talking in hushed tones. At the front of the room, the HOA president stood behind a podium, preparing to start the meeting. When Thomas entered, several people glanced in his direction. Some looked away quickly, but a few met his gaze, nodding in silent support. Lisa was there, sitting near the back, and she waved him over. He made his way to her, feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. This was it. The moment when he would finally confront the HOA face to face. The meeting began, and the HOA president addressed the group. She spoke about the importance of maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic and how the HOA's rules were in place to preserve property values. Thomas couldn't help but notice how rehearsed her words sounded. This was the same argument they had used before, and it was getting old. It didn't matter how much they argued about the value of conformity, his garden wasn't going anywhere. After a few minutes, the president turned her attention to Thomas. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice cool. "We've received your response to our request. We've also taken note of your garden's new status as a historic landmark. While we respect the city's decision, we must remind you that the HOA still has the right to uphold the guidelines of this neighborhood. As we stated in our letter, your garden is an eyesore, and we believe it must be removed." Thomas stood up slowly. He had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to speak his truth. He didn't need to raise his voice, he just needed to be clear and firm. "I understand your position," he began, his voice steady, "but this garden is not just a collection of plants. It's part of this neighborhood's history. It's something that people enjoy and appreciate. I've put years of work into making this place something special, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, all eyes on him. Even the HOA members seemed to be listening intently. "I respect the HOA's role in maintaining the neighborhood, but this garden isn't just about following rules. It's about community. And it's about the people who live here. If the city has recognized it as a historic landmark, that should be the end of the conversation. I won't be removing it, and I'm not backing down." There was a long silence after his words. The president looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Thomas wondered if she would try to argue further, but instead, she simply nodded. "We will take your comments into consideration," she said, her tone cold. "This matter is not yet resolved, but we will review the city's designation and discuss our options moving forward." Thomas sat down, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He had said what he needed to say, and now it was out of his hands. As the meeting continued, he couldn't help but notice that the tension in the room had shifted. The HOA members were no longer as aggressive as they had been. Some even seemed to look at him with a new level of respect. It was clear that the council had recognized his garden as something valuable. After the meeting, Lisa came over to him with a smile. "You did great, Thomas. You stood your ground. I think they'll think twice before trying anything again." He nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The battle wasn't over, but it was one step closer to being resolved. He had fought for what he believed in, and no matter what happened next, he knew he had won the most important victory of all. He had kept his garden. A few days after the HOA meeting, Thomas felt a sense of nervous anticipation. The city council had approved his garden as a historic landmark, but the HOA wasn't giving up. They had made it clear that they still intended to challenge the decision, and Thomas knew that this wasn't over yet. He spent the next few days pacing around his garden, thinking about what he could do next. His determination to keep it wasn't wavering, but he knew the fight was far from over. Then, one afternoon, the phone rang. Thomas picked it up, his heart racing as he saw the familiar number on the caller ID. It was Mr. Johnson from the City Council. "Hello, Mr. Harris. I wanted to update you on the situation," Mr. Johnson's voice came through the line. "The HOA has requested a special review of the City Council's decision regarding your garden. They've asked for a hearing to challenge the historic landmark designation." Thomas paused for a moment, letting the news sink in. This wasn't a surprise. He knew the HOA wouldn't let it go easily. But it still stung. "They want a hearing?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling up inside. "Yes, they do. It's their right to challenge the council's decision, and the hearing will take place next week. I wanted to give you a heads up so you can prepare." "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," Thomas said, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'll be ready." As he hung up the phone, Thomas felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was it, the final showdown between him and the HOA. He had already proven that his garden was important to the neighborhood, but now he would have to stand before the city council again, this time in front of the HOA's representatives, and make his case all over again. For the next few days, Thomas worked hard to prepare. He gathered even more evidence, pulling together letters from his neighbors, more photos of the garden, and even a few local news articles that had written about his garden's significance. He knew he had to make a compelling argument. He wasn't just defending a garden, he was defending his right to have something unique, something that brought joy to the community. The day of the hearing arrived, and Thomas walked into City Hall with a mix of nervousness and resolve. The room was packed with people, neighbors who had shown their support, members of the HOA, and even a few reporters who had heard about the ongoing fight. As he sat down at the table, Lisa leaned over and whispered, "You've got this, Thomas. Just remember why you're here." Thomas gave her a small smile, grateful for her constant encouragement. He wasn't facing this battle alone. With the support of his community, he felt stronger. As the hearing began, the HOA president stood up first, speaking with a practiced ease that made Thomas uneasy. "We believe the decision made by the city council was rushed and doesn't take into account the overall vision for this neighborhood," she said, her voice firm. "While we respect Mr. Harris's efforts in his garden, we maintain that it disrupts the visual harmony of the community and creates an eyesore. We request that the council reconsider its decision and remove the garden's designation as a historic landmark." The words stung, but Thomas held his ground. He could feel the eyes of the room on him as the president finished speaking, and now it was his turn. He stood up, his palms sweaty but his heart steady. He wasn't going to let this woman dictate his future. His garden was important, and he would fight for it. "Thank you for your time," he began, his voice strong. "I understand that the HOA's role is to maintain the aesthetic of the neighborhood, but I believe the true beauty of a community lies in its diversity and individuality. My garden may not fit the conventional mold, but it has become something that people admire, something that brings life to this neighborhood. I've put years of work into it, and it has become a symbol of what this neighborhood can be, a place where people feel welcome, where they can see something different, something beautiful." He paused for a moment, looking around the room. "I know many of my neighbors support this garden. They've taken pictures of it, they've told me how much they appreciate it. I've even had people tell me they visit this neighborhood just to see the garden. It's not just my garden, it's a part of this community." Thomas turned to face the city council members, his voice growing more passionate. The city council recognized it as a historic landmark because it has value, because it represents something more than just a collection of plants. It represents the heart of this neighborhood. It's a place that people come to and feel a sense of peace. And I will not let anyone take that away. He sat down again, his hands trembling slightly but his heart filled with conviction. The room was silent, everyone listening intently to what he had said. He could see that some of the HOA members were taken aback by his words, and for the first time in the meeting, he saw doubt in their eyes. After a long pause, one of the city council members spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, for your testimony. We'll take everything into consideration. This will be discussed at the next council meeting, and you will be notified of the decision." Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had done everything he could. Now, it was up to the council to decide. But no matter what happened next, he knew one thing: he had stood up for what he believed in, and he had given it his all. As the meeting ended and people began to file out of the room, Lisa came up to him, smiling proudly. "You were incredible, Thomas. You really made them see your side." Thomas smiled back, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "We'll see what happens. But I've said my piece, and I know I've done everything I can." The wait was agonizing. Every day felt like a week, and Thomas couldn't shake the thoughts swirling in his mind. Would the city council side with him? Would they recognize the value of his garden and keep it as a historic landmark, or would the HOA win, and his beloved garden would be forced to change? He spent his time tending to the plants, focusing on the simple act of caring for something he had put so much effort into. His garden was his sanctuary, and it reminded him that no matter what happened, he had already made it something special. Finally, the day of the decision arrived. Thomas dressed carefully, choosing his most comfortable clothes. It was a small gesture, but he felt better knowing he was prepared. He drove to City Hall, his thoughts racing as he pulled into the parking lot. His stomach was tight, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He had done everything he could. Now, all he had to do was wait for the city council to make its decision. Inside City Hall, the room was once again filled with people. Neighbors, reporters, and HOA members all gathered for the final hearing. The tension in the air was palpable. Thomas scanned the room, spotting Lisa among the crowd. She smiled and waved at him, offering a silent gesture of support. He returned the smile, feeling comforted by her presence. No matter what happened today, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. The meeting began, and the HOA president stood at the front of the room. "We are here today to review the decision made by the city council regarding Mr. Harris's garden," she began. "While we respect the city's role in preserving landmarks, we still believe that Mr. Harris's garden does not fit with the community's vision. We ask that the council reconsider their decision and remove the garden's historic designation." Thomas felt his heart sink slightly, but he refused to let it show. He had heard these arguments before. Now, it was his turn. When the council called on him, Thomas stood up, walked to the front of the room, and faced the members of the city council. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, but his nerves were steady. This was the moment. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice clear and confident. "Thank you for allowing me to speak once again," Thomas started. "I want to begin by saying how much this garden means to me. I've put my heart into creating a space that not only reflects who I am, but also brings joy to the people who see it. My neighbors appreciate it. They've told me how much they love walking past, how much they admire the colors and the life that it brings to this neighborhood." He paused for a moment, glancing at the members of the council. "This garden isn't just a personal project. It's become a part of the community. I've had people stop by, take pictures, and tell me that it's the most beautiful garden they've ever seen. To me, it's not just a collection of plants, it's a piece of history. A symbol of the diversity and individuality that this neighborhood stands for." Thomas turned to look at the HOA members. "I respect the HOA's role in maintaining the neighborhood, but I believe we can have rules that allow for individuality. This garden is unique, and it has become something more than just a backyard. It's something that has connected people, and I believe that's something worth preserving." His voice grew firmer as he continued, "The city has already recognized this garden as a historic landmark because it represents more than just a patch of land. It represents the spirit of this neighborhood. It's a place where people can come together, where they can appreciate something beautiful and different. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm asking for the right to keep something that brings value to my home, my neighborhood, and my community." When he finished, there was a long silence. Thomas stood tall, his heart pounding but his mind at peace. He had spoken his truth, and now it was in the council's hands. After a few moments, the mayor of the city council stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. We've heard all sides of this matter, and we understand the importance of community, individuality, and preservation. We've reviewed the facts, and after careful consideration, we have made our decision. Thomas held his breath as the mayor paused, the weight of the room hanging in the air. The council members exchanged looks, and then the mayor spoke again. We have decided to uphold the city's decision. Your garden will remain designated as a historic landmark, and the HOA's request to remove it has been denied. A wave of relief flooded over Thomas. He felt a smile break out across his face, and he turned to see Lisa's beaming face in the crowd. She gave him a thumbs up, and Thomas couldn't help but laugh. It was over. His garden had been saved. The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt like he could breathe again. The battle had been hard, but it had been worth it. The HOA had lost, and his garden had been recognized for what it truly was: a piece of history, a part of the community. As Thomas walked out of City Hall, the sun shining brightly on his face, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. The fight hadn't been easy, but it had been a reminder of what mattered most. His garden was safe, and it was a symbol of what could be accomplished when people stood together and fought for what they believed in. Thomas knew that from this day forward, his garden would continue to bring joy, to inspire, and to be a testament to the power of community. It wasn't just about plants and flowers, it was about standing firm and never backing down.